kestrel can either refer to a type of bird or a weather meter. The American kestrel is a small falcon known for this weird thing it does where it hovers before it descends on its prey. And the weather meter is this cool little handheld device that measures weather conditions. Kestrel is also the title of a new book, Kestrel and Other Songs, by our guest and producer, Mason Pashia. Hey, Mason.
Hey, Tom. It's good to see you.
I failed to say that this is the Getting Smart podcast. Welcome to your own podcast.
Welcome to our podcast. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me.
Kestrel's the name of your new book. And because it came out today, I've ordered a bunch, but I haven't read Kestrel yet. Are you referring to the weather meter or to that little pesky falcon?
I'm referring to the falcon. The weather meter is a great additional read on the book.
Where did your idiosyncratic fixation with interesting words come from?
So the longer version of this is one of my favorite writers, Robert Macfarlane. He wrote this book called Landmarks in 2016. And that book, the beginning, talks about every year the Oxford American Children's Dictionary gets rid of words to make room for more words in the print edition. And so in 2016, they got rid of the word acorn and the word elm and another word, and they added MP3 and megabyte. And so the book, of course, he's an eco person, so that was a cause for alarm. But the thing that the thing that he argues in that book is that words are not how we describe what we see, they shape what we see. So he talks about there's a word for the hole that an animal makes when they run under a bush. And over time that forms a hole. And he says, without the word, you never see the hole. So I think that is partially what I love about the hyper-specific kind of strange words and why they catch my ear. There's an inherent music to so much of them as well that I think we lose in common speech. But yeah, that's kind of the more poetic version of why I love weird words.
And you and I also share a love of alliteration. And
true.
So I see that showing up in your poetry. We're going to talk about your new book, but speaking of alliteration, the 4 phases are becoming, burgeoning, belonging, and bursting. You just couldn't help yourself.
I couldn't, no.
I often, you for several years have been publishing Poem a Week on intowind.substack.com.
Yep. You can also just type in masonpashia.com and it'll take you there.
And how many weeks have you been, are you rivaling Tyler Cowen or?
No, I think he's got a couple decades on me, but I've done it for 5 years, almost every week, an original poem or song. And it's kind of morphed over time in terms of how I actually portray those. But it's been a really generative practice. And I've been really grateful for the Substack community that I've sort of stumbled into on there.
It is that art of just ship it, right? The creative tension of putting yourself on deadline and then allowing words and observations and experiences to rattle around and recombine themselves into weekly poem.
Absolutely.
Your poetry more broadly, but Into Wind is interesting because it often includes a picture and then a set of notes. And many of the poems are observational in nature, not necessarily drawn from the immediate week, but from relatively recent experience. And I love how you frequently share the interesting and varied experiences that combine themselves into a poem. How did that form come together?
There's probably some subconscious borrowing going on from other folks. There's a David White collection that has a little meditation on each page after a poem that I was like, oh, this is cool. I think the poet purist in me, when I first started publishing on Substack, if you go back to like the very first posts, there was no description afterwards and there was no photo. And I was like, these two things take away from the poem, or they like augment it in such a way that the poem ceases to be the poem. And with time, I got over myself a little bit and I was like, no, that's not true. I think so much of my own personal goal in poetry is to invite people into poetry. And the people oftentimes have a hesitation when something doesn't make sense or they haven't made meaning of it. And so I was like, what can I do after a poem that starts to put pieces of meaning together without actually making meaning out of it. Because I don't want to ever take that away from someone where they can make the poem mean something different to themselves. But I do think that, like, for me, my one of my favorite things about poetry has always been that the fingerprint of the poet is in the gaps between the images. Like the fact that you can go from a lemon on a table to building a fort to your wife to your grandmother in a poem is really telling about who you are as a person and the experiences you've had. So I want to capture some of those moments that I've had and then let other people kind of do the weaving of what it actually means to have them exist next to each other.
I love that. It reminds me of the first poem you wrote when you were 13. I think it's called Can't See Myself.
Yep, there it is.
Do you remember that?
I yeah, I do. I mean, it was a song, and I came downstairs and I played it for my mom, I think, and then it was the first song that made her cry. And the other ones weren't. I mean, they were, I guess, technically songs, but this one felt like it actually was expressing something. And yeah, I wrote it when I was 13, and that's where the title from the publication comes from. So the chorus of that song is always walking into wind, blown back to the start again, forgot who I could be. Now the boy again is me. And by the end of the song, it has changed to the now the man again is me, which is
Yeah.
bold for a 13-year-old, but
Yeah.
that is
A
sort
little
of the
bit of like
progression.
a Cat Stevens progression there.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Father and son.
I wanted you to share that because the walking into wind is I think an illustration of your earlier point that these poignant phrases land on each of us differently, right?
Totally.
And so what you were sharing, when I heard the walking into wind, I immediately went back to being a teenager up in the mountains in Colorado and feeling that brace of walking into the wind. And so it's interesting how these fragments connect with images in our brain, and for each of us that connection is different and personal, right?
Totally. And I think that that was partially my hesitation with providing an image at all. I never wanted to override what came naturally, but at the same time, I it's kind of my only version of social media. I call it social media. It's just like a weekly a weekly update, and I go a lot of pretty places, so I wanted a repository for that.
I I really appreciate you. You're super thoughtful about all things, but I appreciate you just sort of unpacking the pros and cons of sending along those tidbits. For me, as a more occasional observer of poetry, I really love your notes and the chance to have a little bit of a counterpoint between how I experienced the poem and in the sense of paragatumas, read the poem, talk about the poem, read the poem again. It gives me a chance to read it and react, then get into some background from you, and then to go back and experience it
Mm.
again. And I really love that.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think I've always been obsessed with the actual, like, creative process, and it's also kind of the metacognition piece for me of actually understanding why that came out the way that it did. I'm actually sitting with it when I look at the poem and I sit down to write those, and they're always short, but they always take a long time to actually figure out, like, what is it that I saw that possibly made me think of this thing. So I think it is giving me a better understanding of what it means for myself to make art. I would never put that on anyone else, but I have heard from some other folks that, like, it's been really interesting to see a peek behind the curtain of the process of making something. And I think to that effect, the Into Wind piece, I just wanted to say this before we move on from that song. When I was 13, that line to me was fully negative. Like, always walking
Mm.
into wind felt
Oh,
like you're moving
the
against something.
the headwind, yeah.
Yeah, the headwind. And now I think I have come to a place where it feels more like the wind is talking. It's like like the fact that it's rushing past me is like there's so much to notice in that headwind
Mm.
that is like it become a much more nuanced force. And I think that that is something that I look forward to with getting distance from these poems at some point too, is looking back at how I initially processed them to be like, oh wow, I've actually changed a lot as a person, or just I was approaching it from a totally different vantage. So
We're talking to Mason Pasha. He's the author of a brand new book, came out today, Kestrel and Other Songs. Mason, you have a short kickoff poem.
I
Can you
do.
share that with us?
You bet. So this book is kind of concerned with my move from the Midwest to the Northwest. And so there's a lot of themes of migration and stuff like that in this book. And so the first poem is called From, and it's kind of before all of the other sections. And here we go. This is From. I was advised to write in windowless places. Only loon grazing water, a great log coasts on the back of mist coming down from the Olympics. Today, a duck I'd never seen, black head with a white dot, golden eye, diving, diving. I enter the roiling north estuary, body scream, giggling at the touch, at the touch. Then the shivering, arteries flood after bracing, strange how it sits like a drug on the morning, how the devils float on after leaving dripping coursing, how the driftwood lingers. If only one could write of a place, from a place, then the poet.
In David White fashion, share that last line again.
Yeah.
Writing,
If only one could write of a place, from a place, then the poet.
wow, that's really beautiful.
Thank you.
We live on Poverty Bay, just
Yep.
south of Seattle, and so for my wife and I guess our favorite thing to do early and late is to sit out on the back deck and watch those fishing birds, big and small, dancing in and out of the water. And so you brought me back there. I want to dive into the of writing from a place and of a place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of that is that it feels like since being here, and it could be a combination of place, it could be a combination of age. I don't know what it is, but it feels like my brain has kind of been rewired since being here. It feels like it is in a more of an entangled being now than it once was. And so I think that this collection is trying to grapple with that. Like, is that the first line in the poem, which is I was advised to write in windowless places only. Annie Dillard, who's a really great writer, has written that down. That says like I always go into a closet to write. I never want to see out the window. And for me, I feel this interesting pull between both that I currently write at my dining room table, which has a view of not much, but the outdoor world and the occasional crow. And then I'm also torn by the fact that when I go backpacking or hiking, I always bring a notebook, sit on top of a peak to try and write and just have nothing come out. It's just like there's sort of this like bafflement in the moment where you actually can't use the tools to capture it. And so it's kind of in this tension of like, what does it actually mean to write of a place or from a place? Is that a thing that you are currently inhabiting? Is that a thing that the place has done to you and then it comes out of you later? So I think that's kind of what it's getting at the end. And then the poet is just this propulsion force, I think, into the collection. But yeah.
This also reminds me of our partner Nate and his leadership around place-based learning. And Nate really introduced the country, the world to this idea of learning from and with a place in this multidimensional lens of thinking about economy, ecology,
Mm.
and culture in this integrated synthetic way. And so your closing sort of invited me into that space of
Hmm.
our work together as educators is really inviting them deeply into a place and allowing them to write from a place of a place to really find their expression in their place.
Hmm.
Does that resonate?
Totally. We had a company retreat like 18 months ago or something, and Nate kicked us off with a great quick exercise that I've actually been using in my own life with other people when I get to a new place. I believe it's you find north from wherever you are, just directionally. You find home from wherever you are, and then you walk around and write down questions for 5 minutes that you have about the place. And I think it is such a great way to encounter place and to acknowledge that place is reciprocal. It's a relationship. And so this idea of both of a place and from a place is kind of like where have I come from to be here? That's kind of like finding home from where you are now. And then of a place is those questions that you're asking about it. It's like what does it mean that I am here and that this land is here and who else is here or what else is here? So yeah, I fully buy it. I think his leadership in that has been amazing.
I want to talk about art. You came to work in education, in part because of art, your love of art, your creative eye, and your interest in introducing that to young people.
Hmm.
I want to acknowledge that some of that may have come from two extraordinary parents
Yeah.
that are artists and designers.
I would have
I
said that if you didn't. Yeah.
I think that covered art may belong to the one and only Rebecca Pasha.
Yep. She did that. I've always used her art for other things in my life, whether that be like putting out a song in high school or whatever, just a little snippet. And so for my first book, I wanted to make sure I caught a cool swatch. She does these really textural, abstract oil paintings.
If you want to know more, check out pashapaintings.com, and also appreciate your dad Scott's eye for design and his real commitment to creating powerful learning spaces for the young people of America.
Totally. I think he was the person who taught me to see design in the natural world. I think that is sort of the bridge that I was able to make. Because ultimately, I think my entry into art was a little bit maybe different than a lot of folks, or at least the reason that I loved it. I think a lot of people find art to be sort of an emotional solace, but that was not the reason I kept coming back. It was a place for me that felt like it was a way to train attention. And it felt and attention is something that I've always really been obsessed with, having control over my own. So attention and appreciation were really my two entry points into art, as well as just the feeling that I got when I made something. I think that that was like the other real thread through it all.
Boy, this is a 30-year-old connection, but I guess as my introduction to poetry, I think it was trying to find some sense making out of being a public school administrator and just finding a complete lack of meaning in prose and finding new meaning making in poetry.
Hmm.
And I found a quote that said, poetry is really about attending and remembering, this
Hmm.
attending, this noticing and connecting it to bits and pieces of identity. And so it's focused on attending and remembering. I don't know, does that resonate at all?
Totally. I love it. I think that that is it is for an art form that so many people view as either like restrictive or difficult. I really do think it is one of the most invitational forms. Like you, there is so much room for you in every poem, and I think that that's
Yeah.
a really beautiful thing. But to do that and to do that and earnestly, one must attend, and that is really really hard when the pace is kind of a
Yeah.
complex syntax structure on a page of experiences that you may or may not have had.
All right. I want to come back to that, but let's go back to your entry point into education. And
Yep.
you sort of entrepreneurially somehow created a way to give kids the gift of a little bit of space to do and think about art. Is that right?
Yeah, I had a experience as a substitute teacher, and I thought it was very challenging and was not set up for success for myself or the students, and so I wanted to create some curriculum that basically reinterpreted some of the standards through the lens of an artist, both to give artists some work and also to maybe open things up to students in a new perspective. So I was teaching poetry through music, which is, albeit a small difference, it is a difference in terms of how you approach them. And then I had a friend who wrote a curriculum on teaching geometry through pottery and a couple of other things. And we were just going into classes and trying to kind of spruce things up and say, hey, maybe poetry's never resonated with you, but if you look at it through this lens, more like let it happen to you first and then identify what surprised you in it rather than try to make it a mathematical formula. No shade to math, but that's not the best first step with poetry. Does it sit differently? And how do you feel about the medium then? So it was a really interesting, fun experiment kind of in college and right after.
Our friends at Big Thought in Dallas have had some success introducing poetry, particularly spoken word uh, poetry, as an entry point to that sense of identity development, right?
Yeah,
Beginning to find your story, to tell your story.
totally. And to have confidence using words for aspects of your story that either you don't talk about much or you are communicating to a different audience. It's very different to share your story with someone who's not your close peer in the same age and experiences. So
I bet even most of the folks that we work with don't know that I met you on a hike in the desert, and we got into the subject of introducing kids to art and expression as identity development. And
yeah,
at the end, they said, "Do you want to work together?" I think I want to pivot to futures thinking. You've become quite interested in, I don't know, in the last 5 years, last three in particular, in more intentional and structured ways about thinking about the future, about possible futures. Is there any link to poetry there? Is it where does it come from? Why is it important to you?
the thread between the two is probably something about imagination. I think that that is a muscle that to me has always felt like it was that is inherent to humans, and then our current education system and other factors kind of drill it out of us young, and then it's really hard to get it back. And so I find these exercises in futures thinking primarily to be both like very fun, but also the product oftentimes is pretty useful in terms of helping to put your arms around something that others you maybe wouldn't have been able to otherwise. Adrian Maree Brown has a great quote that is, we live in someone's imagined future, so we have to imagine a better one." And I think the impetus to actually imagine something, to name it, to try and live in it now is so important if you're ever going to actually have a North Star worth guiding toward. And otherwise, we just sort of stumble our way forward and end up with a similar set of conditions down the road. And we're like, oh, I wonder how we got here. So, yeah,
Well, I appreciate that. I heard a quote last week that the future is not a forecast; it's something we design. So
yeah,
it feels like that impulse of being active, proactive, about designing, about being intentional,
totally.
is part of where that comes from. Well, what about abundance? You've become a bit of a sector leader on this topic. Did that emerge out of futures thinking, and how did you end there instead of in complete despair? Because some people that wander into futures thinking end up on the Future of Life podcast talking about catastrophic risk. But
There's definitely a healthy dose of both of those in me, the positive and the negative. I think abundance for me, it's a thought experiment to try and name an approach. And so my role right now, or the one I'm telling myself I have, is sort of to be a liaison between the abundance work that's going on, which is typically more policy and infrastructure building, and really make the case that like that is very true in education as well. We're facing a lot of the same obstacles. And I think that we have come so far as a species that the fact that abundance isn't the default is just sort of puzzling to me.
we'll do a whole nother podcast on that topic because I appreciate your leadership on that front. I think it's quite related to the what I think is the new priority called for by our context variables to be entrepreneurial, the need and opportunity for
Yeah,
invention, creation, expression. Feels like we all have a new and better opportunity to engage in those forms of value creation, of creating value for ourselves, our communities. We've never really focused on that in education and sort of advancing that opportunity with a mindset of abundance. I think can be a real gift to the sector right now.
absolutely. I agree.
Read some of Kestrel for us. It's a long poem, best experience aloud.
So Kestrel is an attempt to retell a classic story, and it's a bit slippery as a result because there is some anchoring and contextual materials. I'm not sure I'll get far enough for you to recognize the story, but that is we'll leave that for the listeners and readers to figure out. So this is the beginning of Kestrel. This dance, the one of wings designed, disintegrating, the thrush and the lush rush starbird over sediment and silt, breeze back. I know her face. As rivers carving shape and gorge surround her warted protrusion, she waits, waits. Verdant death asunder in the shadow of sun. Beneath the careful plodding of life and replication, beneath the careful plodding of pollination and the soft miss kiss. Small footfall, small hymn hum. Somewhere between lost and looking, belief is a precious thing to waste. Whirl whoosh howl through a hollow in a trunk, barunging each treed ring deep sound of time, deep time, of sound all the earth and ear perceiving, crow joins in, caw, carrying freely along the trebly canopy, tinkling, brushing, dragging, a cracked back branch sweep. Here I must tell you that I am Kestrel's brother, kin of oak and larkspur, kin of rushing river. Stir the dusty floor, forest phantom limb, forest nevermore. Small footfall, small hymn hum. I'm going to stop there. But beginning of Kestrel.
Thank you. I better appreciate why you encourage reading it aloud. It's oral and active and mobile. You can almost feel yourself bumping along in the woods, sort of experiencing it.
It was a very fun one to write. It was an interesting experience to try and bundle poems that have been written over 5 years together.
I guess as a poet, you probably you assume you have to do a book because we poets have always done books, and books are usually collections. Is it? Did you come to that conclusion shortly after starting Into Wind?
I think it was a couple years in when somebody new would subscribe, and I'd be like, they would never go back to the first 3 years of like why would someone go back in an archive that is coming out every week? I think that's I feel like we see that with podcasts too. That's such a
Yeah,
challenge of the format
yeah.
is if you're churning, then what is the benefit of the evergreen? And so a book was a way for me to rebundle and add a new layer of meaning on these, to also revise some of the ones that I was like, this is interesting, but maybe not the one for me right now. And I've got I did go back through and kind of did a formatting read. I decided to make everything have no punctuation and all lowercase throughout the book, partially for some philosophical beliefs about what I want to say in the book, and also to kind of transfer that movement of rush. Like I think with no punctuation, you can read it as slowly or as quickly as you would like. And some of these I think have a tendency to sweep you up in them and some less so. But I also just love books. I think they're just an incredible piece of technology and they're great to touch. They're great to bring with you. They become a companion. You can put your own thoughts in there and actually co-create with the book. So
Awesome. While we're on that subject, where can people find it?
yeah, so I put a link more visibly on my Substack page. So that's probably the best place to go. Just
Okay.
masonpasha.com or intowind.substack.com.
Yeah, this connects to something that you and I talk about more weeks than not. Just this combination of thinking about your form of expression and then how to monetize it, how to share it, how to scale it, and that it feels like we have this. I don't know. I have this sense that we have to teach entrepreneurship, that we have to teach expression and entrepreneurship together because it's really about having both an art form and a business model in mind. And I don't know, does that feel too perverting to combine these thoughts
I,
about sharing across a platform? Is that icky or necessary in this new age?
I've been writing a very long essay on this question, so I've been sitting with it a lot lately. If somebody is going to college for art, I think you are doing them a disservice if you are not also teaching them entrepreneurship. And same with high school students who are expressing interest in art. I think you need to have that challenging conversation of like, okay, if this is what you want to do full time, great. But here's some more stuff about business and entrepreneurship. I think that there's also a world of this where I have a bunch of things that I love in this world. Art and poetry is one of them. And I feel privileged to be in a place where I can kind of keep that afloat alongside all the other stuff that I'm doing in my life to where it is not such a cost benefit analysis of making the thing or not. For me, it's like I want to make it and I want to buy enough that I can give them away if I want to, or that if people buy them, that's amazing. But I think my underlying philosophy of this is the best way to pay someone for art is to art in return or to art forward. It's like this true reciprocity gift economy. So if this book got Tom Vanderark writing poems again, like I think maybe it happened once upon a time, that would be the greatest compensation for this book of all time. So I do think that that is the thing that makes art so difficult in a marketplace is the subjective value and the fact that true payment of it is just to continue art forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think you have described the sort of ikigai view of guidance, right? Of coming to grips with what you love, what you're good at, what does the world need, what can I get paid for?
Mm.
Some of those feel like compromising conclusions, but it does feel like a responsible way to encourage young people into the world with some sense of what they have to offer and what the avenues and entry points are for them to share their gifts.
Yeah, and I think that like this is maybe a hot topic or questionable topic. I was talking with our now mutual friend Cara May about this last weekend, but the thing for me that really solidified how I want to approach art going forward was I went to school for songwriting for a year and realized that it was not for me. And then I kind of had an identity crisis. I was like, I've always been the songwriter guy. Like, I don't know what to do. And so I spent some time looking inward and being like, I'm going to break songwriting into its component parts and then project each of them into the future and see if I would be happy doing it. And so it would be like one of them is guitar playing, one of them is singing, one of them is audio engineering, one of them is working at a label, one of them is storytelling. And I ended up being storytelling. That was the thing that I was like, this is the piece that has to be the kernel in everything I do, or else I will get really burned out on it, not at all what they want to do most of the time. And so I think that that inward reflection of like, what is the actual kernel of the thing that I love in art? And how can I make that almost like a polyphonic life? Like, how are you letting that show up in all these different places as you live and looking at it in different ways? So for me, that I do storytelling in a lot of different ways now, and they all bring me a different kind of satisfaction and joy.
I, I was going to ask you, how you think about identity, your identity and identity, but I think you've done a beautiful job of answering that. We're talking to Mason Pasha. He's a partner in Getting Smart. Mason, congrats on your first big book,
I really appreciate it. Thank you, Tom.
Kestrel and Other Songs. Buy it now. We could do another hour on this, but I want to wrap it up just with a word of thanks for Mason. I really appreciate his professional, personal contributions. I love getting your poetry blasts every week. I'd encourage everybody to sign up at intowin.substack.com or, as Mason said, masonpasha.com. And thanks for joining your own podcast. That was fun.
Yeah.
And at this point, I usually thank you for producing this show, but the rest of the Getting Smart team appreciates you and all that you do. And to our listeners, keep learning, keep leading, and keep reading and writing poetry and let it slosh around in your life. See you next week.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast today. We want this podcast to be actionable, insightful, and a great way to learn about what's next in learning. In order to stay on the cutting edge, we need people in the field to tell us what they're hearing, what they're wanting, and what they're needing to learn more about. Got a topic or a guest in mind? Send your recommendations to me, Mason at gettingsmart.com. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or subscribe wherever you listen. Feel free to share the podcast on social media using the hashtag GSPodcasts. Thanks so much.